Hello, and welcome to today's tutorial of getting WSL2 set up on Windows 10 and then subsequently setting up Docker on Windows to connect to your Linux distribution inside of your Linux subsystem on Windows to be able to run containers from within your Linux distribution. Now, before I go too deep into this does require, as of right now, the time recording, a still in development version of Windows, version 19.041, and it's been shown that it does not work with some drivers, specifically Bluetooth and Wi-Fi drivers from Realtek, as well as some older drivers as well might not work with this newer version of Windows, and I can go a little bit more in detail later on. But if that does not work for you, then as of right now, you will not be able to run Docker if you are running Windows 10 home version, because Docker requires WSL2 set up as a backend for it to set the daemon up on Windows 10 home. If you do not have Windows 10 home, you have a different version, you might be able to still download and install Docker without WSL2, in which case you might be able to bypass all of this. If you do not have another version of Windows, you are working on Windows 10 Home, and you still would like to do all of your development inside of a Linux distribution, there are other options, such as using a Raspberry Pi, for example, and then SSH into it using something like PuTTY. That'll give you a command prompt into your Pi, and then you can download extensions for something like Visual Studio Code to also SSH into your Raspberry Pi and work similarly to how I will be working later on in different tutorials after this point. So you can offer those, and I might make a tutorial after some time of setting up a Raspberry Pi to do this if you cannot get the new version of Windows installed. However, as I said, it's early, but once it's fully set out to the public, then everybody should be able to get this downloaded for getting Docker set up on Windows 10 Home. So with that, we will get started. So getting started in here, just a little note that as my computer setup is made, I have an admin account and a user account. And so going forward, I will be working under that pretense that there will be an admin account and a user account. And that if you are also going through this process and you come across a permission error, you can most likely assume that you will be under this same stipulation that you also have an admin account and user account, and you are working on the user account on your computer. And so that should fix any permission errors that come up inside of your own installation of this. So with getting started, we will be working within two Windows subsystems installation guides and one Docker forum that I will be having links to in the description for more details, as well as the commands that I'm going over and running throughout are listed all within the installation guides in the forum with greater detail. So if you want to know a little bit more about the commands, what they might be doing, you can go visit those links. And also, I would recommend you go visit the links to copy and paste these commands directly into your own prompts, rather than trying to type them in exactly as I put them, because one, it will be faster, and two, less prone to error as well. So first things first, we need to set up the optional Windows subsystem feature on your Windows 10 computer. Now, if you are already running Windows Subsystem Linux version 1, then you can skip this step. If you are not running and you're starting off fresh, then you will need to run this next step. So first things first, you want to go to PowerShell. As I said, I am working as an unprivileged user, so I'm going to be running this as administrator. And throughout this, if you're not sure, I would say the best bet would be to follow along run as administrator as I am, or using sudo as I am, just so that way you know everything is working properly. And so the first first command that we're going to use is this one, to tell your Windows 10 computer to enable the Windows subsystem feature. And so after you have that set up, if you would restart right now your computer, you would have Windows subsystem version 1 be installed. Now, you can do that if you just want to stop here and have subsystem 1 for whatever reason. If not, and you want to continue on to subsystem 2, this is where you will need, as I mentioned earlier, Windows 10 version 19041 or higher. And if you want to find out what version you are running, you can go click on Run, and you will want to type in winver, W-I-N-V-E-R, hit enter, and then you will have this pop up, and you will see next to your version OS build 19041 for me. If this is anything lower than this, then you will want to go to your settings and look under Windows Update Settings. And here you can click on Check for Updates. Now, it could say that you could update to 19041, and during that installation, you might have a blue screen and it might roll back. If that's the case, then your computer, as of right now, will not be able to run 19041 version. However, maybe after a month or two of development from Windows further, or a full release later on, then this will be rolled out and you'll be able to have this version work on almost all Windows computers. But that'll be up to whenever Windows can finalize this version or later versions. So if you don't have version 19041, you can come here, try and check for updates. If it says you're up to date, then another option you could have is going and enlisting in the newer version on a Windows website and trying downloading it. That is actually something that I had to do because I had, at the time of my installation, I had Pi-hole running, which was actually blocking some of the Windows 10 installation URLs. And so I actually went myself and downloaded this new update and installed it. And then later on I found what the URLs were and I unblocked them, so I can actually check for updates now. But that's also something to keep in mind, is that if you do have some domain blocker on your network, that could also be hindering you from updating your computer. So that is also something to keep in mind. And so then the next part is, if you are running version 19041, then you can run this next line of code, which will enable the virtual machine platform for Windows 10. And after you run this, you should now restart your computer, and when it restarts, it will install Windows subsystem version 2. And again, if for whatever reason you're not getting an install, like I was at first, then again, check if you have a domain blocker on your network somewhere, or something else might be blocking Windows for some reason, maybe an antivirus, and you want to go in and whitelist the Windows domains for checking for updates or installing updates, and then try and run this command again and try and restart again, and it should work. Now, since I already have all of this done, I'm not going to be restarting my computer, but after your computer is restarted, and if you want to check if it should work, if you have Windows Subsystem version 2 set up, you can run this command, and if you get some sort of error back saying that WSL2 requires an update to the kernel component, then this is coming from the other installation guide that I mentioned earlier, where there will be a link. There will be the actual link to the latest WSL2 Linux kernel that you'll need to install, but I'll also leave the link for the actual guide if you want to go and possibly read more into it for whatever you want. That guide does have future plans for updating the Linux kernel after everything is done here, so you can read into that for later versions if you want to update at a later time. And after you have that installed, you can try and run this command again, and it should come back with this line here saying for more information. All right, after you are sure that you have the second version of Windows Subsystems installed and ready to go, next up is going to be installing your Linux distribution you want. Now there are a few different options. You have Debian, you have Fedora, Kali, Ubuntu, so on. However, in my case, and for future development that I will be working on in my tutorials, I'm going to be working with Ubuntu version 18.04. And so if you want either way, depending on whichever version you want, you will need to go to the Windows Store, and you are going to want to search for whatever version you want. So in my case, I want to search for Ubuntu. Click on version 18.04, and this will install your Linux distribution of Ubuntu 18.04 on your computer. So after you have that installed, you can then go and search for Ubuntu, and this will come up. Now, the first time that you actually have this, you open this application command prompt, you will be asked to enter a new username and a new password for your Linux user. And so you want to make sure you save that password and username, because later on we'll be using sudo, and when you use sudo, it'll be occasionally ask you for your password, so you want to make sure you save that properly. So once you have this in here, something you can do to make sure that you actually have the subsystem working properly is you can run this line of code. Now in my case, I have Docker running on Windows already. As I mentioned, I already have everything installed. So I have the Docker desktop running in the background, and you can see that it is running on version 2. Now you should see some sort of distribution here, and if it does not, if it says version 1, you can leave it version 1. You can always change this between version 1 and 2 later on. You can, but if it says version 1 here, you will probably want to switch over to version 2 when you're completing the rest of this. Now, if you run into any problems, the Windows 10 installation for WSL2, which again, link will be in the description, will have a lot of troubleshooting guides that you can walk through if something comes up, some sort of problem comes up. But at this point, you do have a Linux subsystem. So for example, I could say make directory test from my home, and then cd into test, and then say touch test underscore file.txt, and then, for example, in my case, I use Vim. You can use whatever text editor of choice you want. You got Nano, Vim, VI, but for me, I'm going to use Vim. So you go in here, say maybe testing Linux distribution. All right, and then colon x to save. And now if we cat that file, there you go. So we do have an actual Linux distribution running inside of our Windows 10 machine. So we are all good. That is actually getting the Windows WSL2 set up with a Linux distribution. And if you want, you can stop here, move on to your development. However, for us, we are going to move on to setting up Docker for Windows in the next step. Now, if we want to actually have Docker installed, you will first want to go to the Docker webpage, Docker Hub webpage, and click on download from Docker Hub for your Windows install. And once you have that downloaded, again, if you are running as a unprivileged user, it will ask you for your credentials to upgrade you to an administrator, and that will install Docker as your administrator for Windows 10, and that will use the WSL2 version that we just got set up as the backend for your Docker daemon. Now, you should be able to see in your taskbar the Docker running, and if you click on it and go to Dashboard, we can go to Settings, and in general here you can see this exposed daemon on TCP localhost 2375 without TLS. Now, a word of caution, if you are running this distribution and Docker on some laptop that you're going to be using out in public a lot and doing development out in public, I would not suggest you set this, as this will make your computer unsecured when Docker is running. However, if you're working on a laptop that will mostly be at home and you will turn off Docker while you're away, or you're working on a desktop of some kind, then you should have no troubles setting this up. And then if you want to go in deeper, there's other options here, such as setting proxies, networks, and other stuff that you might want for your Docker. But for our privileges now, we will just be setting this, so that way when you're inside of your distribution, you can run Docker commands, and those will come out and talk to your Windows Docker daemon. Now, you also see this grayed out here saying that you're using Windows Subsystem 2 as your base engine, especially if you are on Windows Home. So that's also a good sign that everything's set up, because Docker was able to be installed and you can see this. So now moving on, we are going to be going into the Docker form that I mentioned that will again be linked inside of the description, and we are going to be going through the different commands that you will need to do to actually install Docker within your Linux distribution. So you just set it up on your Windows, however you also need to set it up on Linux as well. And what you're going to do is, once Docker is set up on Linux, you're going to tell Docker on Linux that your host is actually your Windows computer. And so when you run a Docker command on Linux, it will actually communicate to your daemon on Windows, and that's how you'll be able to set everything up. Now, if you're running this on a Raspberry Pi, then you should be able to just set up everything and run everything on Raspberry Pi. And if you're, say, running a web application that you're testing on your Pi, then if you set it to, say, when you're running your web application, you set it to 0.0.0.0 as the IP address, then when you use your Raspberry Pi's IP address in your browser, you should be able to view your web app from your Raspberry Pi on your desktop. And again, I might be able to set up another tutorial showing this same approach using a Raspberry Pi, and then SSH into the Raspberry Pi and working from there. So your first command you're going to want to do is run sudo apt-get update -y, and the -y is going to say yes to any of your commands. And so for me, type in my password since I'm using sudo. And there we go. We have updated our repositories. The next step is to install all the Docker dependencies. And this will take longer for you. However, since I already have everything set up and installed, it did not actually install anything for me. Next up, we are going to want to set up the Docker key to be able to interface with it later on when we're updating. And finally, for the Docker repository, you want to actually set up the apt repository, so that way it will automatically update, upgrade, and all that when you're running apt update, apt upgrade, or apt install, and so on. And again, all this is running for being set up for Ubuntu 18.04. So if you have a different version of Ubuntu or you're using a different version of Linux, then this repository might be different for you. But for me, this is what I'm running on. I'm also running on an AMD processor, so you see a AMD 64. So now that that's all set up, I can go and run sudo apt-get update y again. And again, you can see this first line here. We now have the Docker Linux repository all in place. So now you should be able to run this. If I can actually copy it. There we go, this. And again, I already have it installed, so it won't do anything for me, but it will install for you. Also, a trick in case you're having a little trouble figuring out how to copy and paste into this command prompt. For me, by the default settings that I have is right click to paste. And you can also, for doing Control V will not do anything. But if you highlight something, you can Control C and that will copy it to your clipboard and you can paste it anywhere else. So now you actually want to set up your Linux user to be a Docker, part of the Docker group, to actually run Docker commands. So you could do this, and now your Linux user is actually set up to run Docker commands if they're privileged. If you are running as an unprivileged Windows user, meaning you just have one account on your computer that's both a user and an admin at the same time, you should be able to close out of this command prompt, open up a new command prompt for your Ubuntu client, and you won't have to use sudo anymore when running Docker or Docker Compose. However, since I'm running on a unprivileged Windows user and I have an admin user separately, I'm still going to have to use sudo. And the reasoning for that is I have to have privilege inside of Ubuntu in order to call the user group and have privilege on it to then communicate with the Docker daemon. So you can close out of here if you want. I will do that, and we can open up a new command prompt. And then next you will be running this to get Python 3 and pip 3 for Python 3. And then again, since I just closed out, it's going to ask for my password. And again, I already have these already installed, so I do not need those. Next, you would be able to run pip3 install for your user Docker Compose. And so after you have this installed, you would be able to run Docker Compose. But there is one thing you need to do still. So if you echo your path variable, you will want to see, if I can find it here, this. So for me, it's /home /myuser /local /bin. You want to have that inside your path for Docker to work. And if you do not see that, then what you can do is you can use Vim or again nano, vi, whichever you prefer, and then your home directory /profile. And then you want to add this line to somewhere towards the bottom of your profile. And so what this will do is on startup, you will have this added to this line added to your path. And so that way Docker will be able to run. So if we exit out of here, and if you did just update that, you can do source profile, and that will update your path variable after you've run it. And so now you should be able to do path, and you should have this show up at the bottom somewhere. So the last thing that you want to do to actually get Docker running officially on your Linux distribution is you want to tell Docker on Linux where its actual daemon is, because right now you just downloaded the Docker CLI interface, and you did not download the actual Docker requirements to actually run a daemon. So there is no daemon running on your Linux distribution. So you actually need to set that up, and that's coming from your Windows 10 Docker daemon. So in order to do that, you want to actually run this line of code. Copy. There we go. Now, something that I've had to change from this line of code to work with the Windows 10 Docker daemon, because mine was not seeing it, was I had to change localhost to 0.0.0.0. You can try and set this to localhost first if you want, but for me, I had to change this to 0.0.0.0 in order for this to work. And what this will do is this will first put the export line for Docker host at the end of your bashrc file, and then it will reload your bashrc file to have Docker host B become an environment variable for you. But since I already have that, I'm not going to want to add it again. So instead, after you have this done, you should be able to run Docker commands. Now again, if you're running on an unprivileged user, you could just run this. However, if you're unprivileged, you'll see this come up. You'll see cannot connect to Docker daemon at TCP. Is it running? And that's because it actually doesn't see the daemon if you're not running as a pseudo privileged user for your Linux distribution. So if we change that and do this, you can now see all of your Docker information for Windows. And so from here, you now can run Docker files. You can run Docker Compose YAML files with Docker Compose. You should be good to go. However, there is one last thing you could want to do, and that could be mounting your hard drives from Windows 10 into your Linux distribution. Now, some reason you might want to do this is, say you're working on something in Linux and you want to perhaps email that to somebody. And so you would want to bring that to your Windows computer in order to attach it to an email. Or say there's a file that can only be opened properly on Windows, but you create that file in Linux. So you might want to easily bring that over to your Windows computer. So you can mount your drives for easier access. And a little bit of a warning if you do this actually is if you mount your drives, say for example I have my drives mounted, so if I go to say CD into my C drive and then my desktop. Now I'm actually on my Windows desktop directory, and so technically I could run code if I say have an shell script file out here on my desktop, or if I have some Python code or a Docker file out here, I could potentially run that from this terminal and the file would run in Linux. But the problem with that is, and this is a known bug right now with this 19041 version, is that doing this will be very costly, both in time and in memory. For whatever reason, the more commands you run on mounted drives, the longer each subsequent command will take. Also, it might take up more RAM as well, which I did actually see this before, where I was doing development in one of my hard drives and from Windows, and it took 10 minutes to run a simple ls command, or another 30 minutes just to run a docker command. So this will be very time consuming if you do this. However, as I mentioned, something that this could be very useful for right now is to copy files. So if I say go back to my home directory and we have that test folder I have set up, I could copy that test file into my desktop. So test_file.txt. And so now I have this file here. And I can open that up, and we see I have testing Linux distribution here that I made earlier. So now I can work on this file on Windows if I want to. So that's one thing that I have actually noticed that this is good with. And if this is something that you might be interested in, then this is something also that the Docker forum that I mentioned earlier does to go over. And if you would like to do that, you would want to sudo text editor command, for me it's vim again, and then -etc-wsl.conf. And you will want to have these 3 lines of code in this file. And what these will do is when you start up a new command prompt into your distribution, this will mount those drives to your command prompt. And so that way you'll be able to do like similar what I just did and just either go into those directories, manipulate files, or move files around in Linux. And so that is something that you could do. And again, the forum goes a little bit more in detail about what each option does, also possible errors that could come up. And so I do suggest you actually do go look at that forum if you want to know more about the background of all this, as well as if any errors do come up in this process. And one thing to note is when you do finish editing that file and saving it, you will need to actually sign out of your user. So you want to sign out here and sign back in, because then this change that you just made will actually take effect. Just closing this will not work. Just, as I mentioned, closing, opening, or switching users, you will actually need to sign out and sign back in for it to work properly. And then once that's done, you will have your mounted drives. Now for the last part is, what if you would like a little more detail than just working on Nano or Vim for all of your files here? Say you're working on a fairly large project with many files, you might want to move back and forth very quickly or copy paste fairly reliantly in different files at a time. Well, something that actually works well with this subsystem is Visual Studio Code. And so if you go on and download Visual Studio Code for your Windows computer, then you can, if I do Visual Studio Code, and so you're on here, you go to, there we go, extensions, and you want to search for this extension, remote-WSL. So if you just search for WSL, it's one of the first ones that will pop up on your option list. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to start up a connection within your Linux distribution. So I'm in my test directory here. I can just do code dot to say, hey, I want to open Visual Studio Code within my Linux distribution in the current directory. And that'll open up. And you can see I am down here connected through my Windows subsystem version Ubuntu. And I have my one file here. And I can open this up in here, or I can create a new file and say test file 2.txt. And this is a second test. And if I save that, I can come back here and cat, well, I can first list that file is there, and if I cat that file, there we go. This is a second test. Now you will notice that concatenating it into this, you do have the different versions of new line characters. So I actually do not have a new line character here, but if I save this and run it again, and there you go, there's actually a new line character. And that is an option if you would like that new files are always have an empty line at the end. If you do prefer to do this, that isn't a property that you can set inside of Visual Studio Code to change that so that it does have a new line in case you do concatenate files fairly often, like this. But once that's done, you're all set. You can now create new directories, go into them. If you work with Git or something, you can git sudo apt install git. For me, I already have it because that's something I use. And once you have Git, you pull down or create a new repository, you run whatever code generation you want, and then do code period, and you can now do all your work nice and neat inside of Visual Studio Code. And the best part is that it will still update in real time between Visual Studio Code and your subsystem. So if you have any workers watching your code, say for example if you're running an Ember and you're having a worker watch your code, then you could have your subsystem running in the background, Visual Studio Code editing, say, an HTML file, and your actual web server open in your browser, and you could edit something in Visual Studio Code, save it, and it will automatically refresh in your browser. So with all that said and done, you now have a Windows subsystem with Docker running and Visual Studio Code all set up, so you can now do whatever Docker development that you could want in Windows using a Linux distribution. So with that, thank you very much, and I will see you in the next tutorial.